It happened on September 24, 2017. My friend and I were driving home from Chicago, where we had gone to visit relatives. We were driving along the M5 highway. It wasn't the first time we'd been to Chicago, but I hadn't noticed anything interesting before, either because I wasn't looking too closely at the scenery or because I was always absorbed in conversation. Just ahead, if I remember correctly, the girl spotted an abandoned church to our left. We don't like to tickle our nerves, so without thinking, we turned our footsteps in the direction of that church. It didn't take us long to reach the church. The abandoned church stood in the middle of a vacant lot. It was easy to get inside. There were remnants of wrought iron hinges in place of the door. There were no other statues or other remains, but there was a dilapidated staircase leading up to the bell tower. The first floor was badly eroded by water or wind, and there was a large mound of earth. If I had added my weight to it, it probably would have collapsed and covered me with the debris of the bell tower. Under the dome, which was about 8 meters high, hung a chain with a hook in the middle, around which a small bat was circling. It was an impressive sight. While my lover made his way to the bell tower to try his luck, I stood looking at the dome, trying to find at least a fragment of the surviving painting. And then an inscription caught my attention. It was painted in charcoal as far as the eye could see, but what surprised me most was that it was so high up that I had to climb a long ladder to get to it. It was then that it began to interest me. Then I unconsciously began to read it aloud, trying to recognize the blurred inscription. The inscription was as follows: Aya, I swear. Then it said something in English letters. There were several similar words such as decrate and decrates. Just as I was about to read the last word, a girl sneaked up behind me and said, "Don't read," and received a deafening blow. Immediately thereafter, the plaster remnants of this inscription broke off the wall and fell to the ground at our feet with a thunderous crash. It stunned us. I realized that if this continued, the church would collapse, so I got in my car and hurried home. But it didn't end there. Once we got home, we unpacked, sat down to watch shows and talk about our latest adventures. And before I knew it, we were asleep. I woke up to a strange scratching sound outside the window. I didn't look at my watch. The first thing that occurred to me was how it could be heard so clearly through a plastic window on the 8th floor and with no trees nearby. When I pulled back the curtains, there was nothing. It had been 2.5 weeks since that day. A week ago, it was not only outside the window, but also outside the door of my room, in the closet, and then it was joined by a whisper. Whispers in a language I don't understand haunt me every night. Since the beginning of this week, it has become much louder and is already driving me crazy. The girl does not notice anything, does not hear or see anything. She probably thinks I'm out of my mind, too. Today, she rashly suggested that I go to the hospital, but I'm sure that won't do any good. Yesterday, besides the gnashing of teeth and whispering, I was hallucinating. I could clearly see 3 black fingers crawling between the door and the floor, making the same sound I had heard when the 3 black fingers were cutting through the door and the floor and scraping the laminate. After sitting up all night on the internet, I found no information about this abandoned church or its layout. There were only a few articles researched by similar tourists, but nothing cryptic. I think it will be over soon. It is known in our region for its very old church in ruins, built in the 18th century. It is said that before that there was a gallows on which criminals were hanged. The church was built later to consecrate the place. During the Revolution, as elsewhere, the church was destroyed, and rumor has it that priests were thrown off the roof. Today the church has a bad reputation. Strange things happen, people see ghosts, and the place itself seems to be covered with a kind of dome to hide the horror. The church stands on a cliff. 2 sides are cliffs, and the third is a field. As recently as 7 or 8 years ago, tombstones could be found on the sides of the cliff, but they too are old and dilapidated. The church has fallen into disrepair over the years, and it is dangerous to walk inside because bricks have fallen off the roof and vandals have cut all the ironwork inside. There are rumors that evil spirits live under the rock of the church. During the Soviet era, attempts were made to rebuild the church, but workers were killed during construction. There is also an underground passage in the building, and in the 50s and 60s children from the neighboring village dug through it and buried themselves. According to a friend of mine, he saw it too. He went there with a young man, pitched his tent by the cliff, made a fire, and saw lights flying over the church at night and making different figures. I didn't believe him until the next year, when I went with him and friends on vacation. When it got dark and we were sitting around the fire, I looked in the direction of the church and saw a white ball rising. It looked like the moon, but after a minute or so it rose behind the church, at which time it rose into the sky and slowly moved away like a normal moon. My friends, surprised by this, waved goodbye. The next time we arrived was at night, and we heard quiet, indecipherable male voices coming from inside the church. We were sure no one was inside. Another time, we started the trip late, and our friends had to wait for us there with campfires and tents. It was August, it was getting dark early, and it was 10 p.m. when we arrived. It was a long drive, about an hour, and we drove through villages, bushes, and woods, up a steep valley, and then through fields to a bluff near the church. As we went up the steep valley, there was one wall about 30 yards from the church that looked like it was lit by a spotlight, but there were no lights behind the wall, and no cars stopped nearby. When we reached the cliff, our acquaintance had already put out the fire and was gathering his things. When I asked him if it was far and why, he said an old man was coming. He said the old man was coming from the church, and the boy recognized him. The boy recognized the old man and thought he must have come from the village. But when he looked, the old man was gone, as if he had been carried away by the wind. There was something different here. We jumped into the valley, but there were bushes, and we must have heard footsteps. Eventually, we found the old man and ourselves, and camped again for the night. But the nature there was so colorful that I took pictures in 2006 to 2007. One of them showed a dot in the background of the black forest. When enlarged, its silhouette resembled a flying angel in a long dress with its arms outstretched in front of it. Unfortunately, my hard drive died a few years ago, so I don't have any pictures left. One more moment. On the other side of the church, in another valley, stands an abandoned house. It is now mostly ruined and turned into firewood, but in 2006 to 2008 it was still intact. There was furniture, a soup kitchen, and curtains. Old letters were found and taken home. In that atmosphere, people would get up and drop everything. When I went back to my parents' house a few years later and went through my old things, I realized that the letters were no longer there. I wondered where they had gone. The first time I went with my friend, but I didn't stay there long. I was in a panic. I felt suffocated. I was enveloped like air. I wanted to run away, as if I had hit an invisible wall. I went with a friend about 2 years ago, and there was nothing like that there anymore. Maybe it was because they were strict atheists. I'm an atheist too, but I believe in ghosts and otherworldly things. I haven't been to a place like that in a long time, maybe because I was tired of going to the same place. It was believed that my village was in a strange place, with a ruined chapel and a very old cemetery across the river. In the past, witches and sorcerers lived in my village, and people hid in the chapel, so it was believed that the river served as a kind of barrier. A little note about our chapel. It is a small, dilapidated building that is rumored to be very rich in gold. There are holes all around it, and you can see through the windows that everything inside is also falling apart. The wrought iron gates, which have survived, were closed to keep the locals from wandering around. Nearby are the remains of the bell tower, the dome of which has recently been dismantled. In the neighborhood is an old cemetery, and in some places overgrown graves, and even stone coffins appear. However, there are still graves in the neighboring villages, across the river, on the church side. There is also a cemetery on our side of the river, where all the inhabitants of my village are buried. Strangely, none of them lived to be 60 years old. This cemetery is closed to burials because of the wheat fields in front and the river flowing behind. About 30 to 40 years ago, we had a grandmother who was a healer, but she lived alone and rarely left her plot. Once in a while we would come to her for healing and fortune-telling. She was the last of the locals. Time passed, my grandmother died, and years later her mummy was found in ruins. She had no relatives, no loved ones, and no will, so people donated what they could and buried her near the church. People who helped her at the time came to her grave to put flowers and tidy up the area. But one day the grave suddenly started moving and disappeared, as if she had never been there. Then they reappeared, sometimes even in the fields and fields. Many people said that the spirit drove the witch out of the holy place, and she could not find her place. And so she left. Later the story was forgotten, and some people recalled witnessing strange scenes with mounds and crosses appearing in inappropriate places. Last summer we went with friends to the dacha to play, drink, relax. We swam during the day, ate shish kebab in the evening, and went for a walk. They suggested we go to church, but some very sensitive people couldn't stand it and canceled the trip. We decided to go to the woods in the middle of the homestead, built a fire, and started making up scary stories about the church. I remembered the legend of the unaccepted grave. After some scaring, we all decided to go home. On the way, the beer hit my head and I hid out the door. I stopped in a leap and slowly zipped up my pants, looking around. My eyes were used to the dark, and the moon was bright on this night. A step away, under a willow tree, was a wrought iron cross, green with old age, and a small, water-rotten grave mound with a broom of wildflowers rotting on it. I was about to urinate for the second time in Mia, and the story immediately came to my mind. I ran to everyone and told it like it was. Of course, they laughed at me, but said that maybe someone buried someone here. You never know. I burst into tears, took my brother, and showed them the grave, but it was empty under the willow tree. I passed out and woke up in bed. All night long I dreamt of a woman in a black shroud, stretching out her bony arms toward me, but I could not come closer because the river flowed between us.